Hey guys, this is Pastor Caleb, and welcome to our new Thursday night series as we get into answers for some of life's more difficult questions. On Thursday nights, we're going to be starting a series here with Professor or Dr. Sean McDowell. We got his permission. He is an apologetics professor over at Biola. Some of you guys might know his dad, Josh McDowell, who wrote a really famous book. Sean has been putting out content weekly for a long time, and I have just been a great fan of some of the discussions, the guests, the people that he brings on, because I feel like he really is trying to equip us, the church, with resources for how we can engage in the world. So I got his permission, and over the summer, July and August, we're going to do a Thursday night series where each week we're going to put out one of these discussions or interviews that he's done and try to equip you so that we can be salt and light, so that we can be ready to give an answer to the hope that we have. I hope that you're blessed. I hope that you enjoy these on Thursday nights, and then we can follow up if you have questions, if you have prayer requests. You can always text the church, 714-879-3314. We'll also include a link to Sean's YouTube channel where you can find hundreds of videos on everything from how to share your faith to topics like these to a whole bunch of different resources that he has there on his channel. Again, we hope that you're blessed. We hope that you enjoy this, and we hope that you'll join us on Sunday mornings at 10 and 12 as we continue to unfold God's Word to answer life's most difficult questions. All right. Enjoy.
Is there archaeological evidence to support the life, death, and ministry of Jesus? Well, my guest today says there is surprisingly good evidence for Jesus that many people have missed. My guest is Dr. Titus Kennedy. He's an archaeologist. He's a professor with me at Biola University, and he's the author of a great new book we're going to talk about called Excavating the Evidence for Jesus. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of chronologically walk through issues in archaeology related to the birth of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, the trial of Jesus, culminate in the resurrection. So kind of walk through this chronologically. Dr. Titus Kennedy, you ready to rock and roll?
I am. Thanks for having me back on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's dive in. And one of the most common criticisms that I find myself responding to is that the census involving Quirinius is mistaken in the Gospels. You think that archaeology can shed some light on this, and it's not the problem that many people have raised.
Absolutely. This is one of those parts of the Gospels that is routinely attacked or disregarded, as you said. But the main issue really comes down to, are people believing what Josephus says and their interpretation of what he's saying, or are they looking at the archaeology that might connect to how Luke is describing things? So Josephus talks about this Roman official, Quirinius. He was a well-known guy. He was not some figure that is shrouded in mystery. He held the position of consul even, which is the highest rank you could get in the Roman government. And he commanded legions. He was a governor. He had many high political offices, and we have writings about him as well as inscriptions. So Luke associates him with this census of the empire. And then later we see in Josephus, when he wrote near the end of the first century, he talks about Quirinius, but he talks about him specifically in Judea, how he is there for this tax accounting, essentially. And he's there after Archelaus is deposed, and he is trying to get a sense of their financial situation. So I, first of all, don't think that what Josephus is talking about is the same event as what Luke is talking about. Josephus is discussing something that occurred in 6 AD, and it seems to be localized and connected with the transition of power from Archelaus to then a Roman governor, a Roman prefect. Whereas Luke, he says that he is talking about an empire-wide census that was ordered by Caesar Augustus. And for that, we have to go and look at Caesar Augustus's records, in which he talks about 3 empire-wide censuses that he ordered. The only one that is anywhere close to the birth date of Jesus, or the proposed birth dates for Jesus, is a census that was ordered in 8 BC. And we see Herod, King Herod the Great, he died in 4 BC, probably March. Okay, so we know that it had to occur before that. If we have this census, empire-wide census, that Augustus talks about, starting the order in 8 BC, we're looking in that window. And there is a, I think, very important Latin inscription that was found in Beirut, which was at the time Syria province. Syria was connected or over Judea in terms of Roman jurisdiction. And it talks about a census that has been ordered in the time of Augustus, and how this military official, it's his tombstone, how Quirinius is the one who is in charge of it in that region, because he is this commander of legions. He's a legate.
So, if I'm tracking correctly, there is extra biblical evidence supporting a statewide census in which people would be sent home to their place of origin to be recorded as supported in the Gospels.
Right. There's extra biblical evidence for an empire-wide census during Augustus. Then there's extra biblical evidence for Quirinius specifically administering the census or being over the census in the Syria province area, which included Judea. Okay. And there's extra biblical evidence from papyri, like in Egypt, for example, of people going to their homes to register for these censuses.
So why is this still considered such a problem to critical scholars if there is the kind of extra biblical evidence that you're talking about?
Primarily, it's 2 reasons. First of all, many scholars have been stuck on this idea that client kingdoms didn't participate in Roman censuses, and Judea was a client kingdom at the time of Jesus' birth. But we have evidence to the contrary of that client kingdoms were actually participating in Roman censuses. So sometimes that idea just might be based on outdated information, like where we lacked information in the past. And then secondarily is that many scholars are taking the Josephus passage as the same event that's talked about in Luke, even though Luke is talking about empire-wide and Josephus is talking about just a local Judea-specific event.
That's really helpful. So you look at the archaeological record, you think there's no in principle contradiction with the biblical account as recorded during the time of Quirinius and the census. Okay, let's move to number 2. One of the criticisms we often hear is that this slaughter of the babies by Herod, there's no record of this, wasn't possible, and the biblical account should be dismissed. Your thoughts?
Yeah, again, this is something that relies heavily on Josephus and how we interpret Josephus, or how we look at him in terms of a comprehensive historian. So Josephus does not mention this slaying of babies in the Bethlehem area. And that is the major criticism of Matthew. They say that, why doesn't this pop up in Josephus? He records a lot of things. He does record a lot of things, but he is primarily concerned with the main powerful politicians at the time. He's not talking about what they would consider to be less important events. So Bethlehem, in the time of Jesus, was this tiny little village, almost like a outside rural suburb of Jerusalem. And if there were babies that were killed in Bethlehem at that time, it would have been in the number of, say, 10 or 20. It wouldn't have been hundreds or thousands of people.
This also fits with what we know about Herod, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Herod was known to be paranoid about losing his throne, and he had all sorts of political rivals killed, including 3 of his own sons. And the worst of this happened near the end of his life, which is right in the window that we're looking for in terms of the year of the birth of Jesus. And so it's very plausible in terms of what Herod would do. It's even expected.
That's a good way to put it, that the archaeological evidence doesn't prove that the slaughter happened, but there's nothing that contradicts it. And it's fair to ask whether we would expect to find Josephus referring to something that involved 10 or 20 babies. And to do so would be an argument from silence anyways. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about some of the key objections to the birth of Jesus. Let's shift to the ministry of Jesus in Galilee. Does archaeology either illuminate what happened there or in any way support the reliability of the gospel accounts?
Absolutely. We know so much about the archaeology of Galilee now. All the places that Jesus visited, we can at least identify the towns, cities, and villages, and sometimes even more specific geographical locations than that. And there's been some stuff found quite recently that has further illuminated this. So when you think about some of the key places, Nazareth, all right, first of all, then Capernaum, obviously another very important location. We've got Magdala. We have Kursi, which is probably the site where the swine ran down the hill. And have the Mount of Beatitudes area. And then we have Chorazin. And we've got actually some recent first century evidence at Chorazin that we didn't know about before. And so all of these places have evidence of occupation in the first century, just as the Gospels claim, including Nazareth, which was critiqued in the past. And in Capernaum, we've got things like the synagogue in which Jesus would have taught, and probably the house of Peter, which then got turned into an early meeting place for the church later in the first century. So, we have a lot of things that illuminate from Galilee, and we have several things that also corroborate specific sections of the Gospels.
Are there anything in the region of Galilee that seems to undermine or contradict the biblical teaching on Jesus during his ministry season?
Really not anymore. In the past, one of the issues, as I mentioned, was Chorazin, that we hadn't found any first century occupation there, but that has been uncovered recently. Nazareth previously also had some issues where the archaeology there was just not clear, not much had been done, but subsequent years has uncovered quite a bit of first century material, and not only first century material, but artifacts and tombs that demonstrate that the people who are living in Nazareth were Jews who were observing the Mosaic law. And so it all connects very well to what the Gospels are recording about that region.
So what about the miracles of Jesus? And obviously some of these were in Galilee and in other areas as well. Are there any archaeological finds that at least add a kind of corroborative support or illumination to the miracle accounts in the Gospels?
So from an archaeological perspective, we could look at the miracles in two ways. One, we can look at where some of these happened and see the descriptions and the text of the Gospels, and yes, that fits the archaeological find. And then the second component would be we can look at the way in which people during the first and second century regarded the miracles of Jesus, if they thought that he performed any, and what their view of them was. So if we go and look at a couple examples of locations or archaeological context, two that I always like to point out are the pools of Siloam and Bethesda in Jerusalem. So Bethesda, that's in chapter 5 of John, and he talks about these 5 stoas. And that stumped a lot of scholars in terms of what was the shape of this pool. Like, why is it described with 5 stoas? Is it 5-sided? But when this area was excavated, they found that the 5th stoa ran through the middle, essentially dividing the pool into upper and lower sections. And so John was describing it very accurately. He just didn't go in and give us a shape but he did tell us how many different stoas were there. So, that was a real location, and people had the memory preserved, so to speak. They knew that some miraculous healing had happened there. And when Hadrian came in the 2nd century, Emperor Hadrian, and he tried to essentially erase the historical memory of Christianity, or he tried to syncretize it with Roman deities, he had a temple to Asclepius built over the pool of Bethesda, and that's the Greek and Roman god of healing. And so he wanted people to associate the healing miracles with the work of Asclepius, not with Jesus. And I would say that's something that at least tells us the story was swirling around and people knew about the story of Jesus healing this man at Bethesda.
Fascinating. So we've talked about the birth of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, some of the locations tied to the miracles of Jesus. And there's so much more in your book that you talk about. But let's shift to the trial of Jesus. Obviously, the Gospels focus a large percentage of the time that culminate in the trial, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Let's talk about the archaeology we find there. And let's talk about 5 key characters in the trial of Jesus and see what the archaeology shows about them. Let's start with Annas. Is there archaeological support for Annas?
All right, so Annas, the high priest, and he is mentioned in Luke 3:1 as actually one of 2 high priests at this time. It says when Annas and Caiaphas were high priests. Now this is something that throws people off oftentimes, because they're wondering, how can there be 2 high priests at the same time? And that is a reflection of what was going on in the Roman period. So obviously under the Mosaic law, there's only 1 high priest at a time. The high priest was appointed for life, so he would serve until he died or until he was just unable to do his duties any longer. So people considered someone a high priest for life. But when the Romans took power in Judea province, they started to appoint and depose high priests based on who had political favor. So Annas fell out of favor and he was deposed, and then in 18 AD, Caiaphas was appointed as the high priest. So we're looking at it from the perspective, both the Judean and the Roman perspective, and that's why they both are said to be high priests. If we get into what's the evidence for Annas outside of the Gospels, well, Josephus talks about Annas as a high priest. In fact, that is why we know when he was deposed, when Caiaphas was appointed, what's going on with this whole political appointment thing. But also, in addition to having attestation in Josephus, it seems that the tomb of Annas has been found just outside of the walls of ancient Jerusalem. And it's most elaborate 1st century tomb of its type that's been discovered in that area. And that is certainly fitting of a wealthy and powerful high priest like Annas, and it's exactly in the location where Josephus says that his tomb was located.
So archaeological and literary support for Annas. What about the other high priest, Caiaphas?
So high priest Caiaphas, we have even more evidence for him. Of course, is also attested in Josephus, and his first name is given to us. It was Joseph Caiaphas was his name. So Caiaphas is the family name. And in 1990, they discovered a family tomb of the Caiaphas family just outside of the walls of ancient Jerusalem. And within this tomb, there were inscriptions on some of the ossuaries. One of the ossuaries, actually the most ornate, the most intricately carved of these, had the inscription, Joseph, son of Caiaphas, written in Aramaic. So we have his name fitting, extremely ornate ossuary. This is before 70 AD. We know because when Jerusalem was destroyed, they stopped burying in this fashion in Jerusalem. And there was a coin that was found in there that dates to 43 AD, a coin of Agrippa. So we know that he died after 43 and before 70. Well, that fits really well with what we know of Caiaphas. And then the bones they found in there were of a 60-something-year-old man. So pretty solid right there. But even more so, recently another ossuary was discovered that was actually of the granddaughter of Caiaphas the high priest. And on her inscription, she gives her lineage, but then she says that they're from the priestly line of Maaziah, which is mentioned back in the book of Chronicles. So we have a really solid connection there that this Caiaphas family was a priestly family. And then we have this ossuary or bone box of Caiaphas the high priest.
It's pretty amazing to think about. From 2,000 years ago, the two high priests that were responsible for the trial of Jesus, we have very good archaeological evidence that two of them existed. What about Herod Antipas? Obviously, he had a different role than the high priest. What's the evidence archaeologically for him?
Well, Herod Antipas was the local ruler of Galilee, and that's where Jesus' hometown was. Nazareth was in Galilee. And when this trial was going on, you see Jesus getting passed around from leader to leader. And Pilate really didn't want to have anything to do with it, so he was hoping that Antipas could just deal with it as the royal or the leader of Galilee. So Antipas, what do we know about him? Well, he also is attested in writings of Josephus. Also, Philo talks about him. But we have so many of the coins that he issued during his reign with his name on them. So Herod the Tetrarch, that was his title, Herod Antipas the Tetrarch. We have all sorts of architecture that he had constructed during his reign, such as the new capital that he had built at Tiberias, where he lived. So, we have the place where he lived as well as various cities and buildings that he ordered to be constructed. So the overwhelming evidence is there for Herod Antipas.
What about the last person tied to the trial of Jesus, Pontius Pilate?
Pilate is also very well attested in Josephus, in Philo, in Tacitus. And so they're, from a Roman record perspective, there's no question about him. He is the governor of Judea at this time. We know many different things about him, but he also issued coins during his time as the prefect of Judea, although these didn't have his name on them because he did not have the rank to be able to do that. So he uses the of Tiberius, the emperor. But in 1961, while they were excavating at Caesarea Maritima, the Roman capital of the province, they discovered this monumental stone slab with a Latin inscription. And it said, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, dedicates something. It's broken off. It was something to Tiberius. And so that was our first record of Pontius Pilate from an archaeological source. But then, very recently, a ring was discovered with Pilate's name on it. And so this was probably used by someone in his administration, not by him personally. It was a bronze ring. It's got the name Pilate, Pilato in Greek on it. It was found at Herodium, just south of Jerusalem. And so that's our second archaeological inscription that points to Pilate.
It really is pretty amazing if you pause and think about it. The key figures from the high priest, Herod Antipas, to Pilate, we have literary and significant archaeological evidence in the time and the place with the authority that Scripture reports. What about three locations that are tied to the trial of Jesus? For example, we're told that it took place at the Sanhedrin. Do we have evidence for that location?
Yeah, we've got some archaeological evidence for each of the three main locations, or one I would say is more tentative, but they start off, he gets taken to the house of the high priest. Now there are three priestly houses, or priestly mansions, we might call them, in Jerusalem that have been excavated so far. And there are varying opinions on which one would be the house of Caiaphas and Annas, but a very good example of one, at least, is sometimes called the burnt house. And this thing is incredible in its preservation and in the amount of decoration from the first century, these colored mosaic floors and painted walls. They had their own bath and ritual baths in there. And then there was an inscription found in there that mentioned the Cathros family. Well, this was a later high priestly family. And so we have evidence that that building, that mansion, was being used by a high priestly family after the time of Jesus. And it may have been used by the priestly families in the first century. You know, they may have exchanged residences when they were in that office, kind of like different countries. You know, a president has his designated house, the prime minister has their designated house. So I would say it's tentative, but at least gives us a really good example. And we do know that in the first century, high priests had this big mansion type of house like we see in the gospel.
I appreciate that you use words like tentative and likely and probable, because these things aren't matters of certainty. They're assessments based on the evidence that we have. What about the Praetorium?
Well, first, I want to say something about the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin moved to the south side of the Temple Mount in about 30 AD. So in the time of Jesus, they would have been in a relatively new location. And although that whole temple complex got destroyed, there on that side, on the south side, there are some remnants of column capitals that have been discovered that were part of the stoa there. And so we can see where this hallway was that they may have met in. So we've got a little bit of remnants of the building in which they would have met.
That's amazing to think of the very place where they met and condemned Jesus. That's stunning. What about the Praetorium?
The Praetorium was the Roman official residence, the governor's residence, and they had them in Caesarea and Jerusalem in Judea because, as I mentioned earlier, Caesarea was the Roman capital of the province, but Jerusalem's obviously the traditional capital, and that's where all the festivals were centered, so they needed to have a Roman presence in Jerusalem during those festival times. This was located in the former palace of Herod the Great on the western side of Jerusalem. And we have information about that in Josephus and Philo, talking about the palace of Herod then getting used as the Roman residence. Some of this has been excavated. In fact, in the 1970s, some very important components of the Praetorium were excavated, including what appears to be the stone pavement that Jesus would have been standing on during the trial with Pilate that John talks about, and what also John mentions as Gabbatha, or raised place, and then the Bema. So if you go there today, you can actually see this raised up platform with a stone pavement on it and what looks like a Roman period Bema, all this stuff from the first century. And then it also, I think, helps us to understand how there were these Pharisees and priests outside of the Praetorium yelling, "Crucify him," at Jesus. You wonder, like, how did they know what was going on in the trial? Well, you see, it's this raised up area, like a Roman Bema type of structure.
Interesting.
And there's no wall closing it all off. So it was open. They weren't actually entering the building, but they could see them up there. And that's how they could hear and see and then yell without going into the building and without then making themselves ritually impure right before Passover.
So it comes to the trial of Jesus. We've got evidence for the main players, both Jewish and Roman. We have evidence for 3 of the main locations that this took place that all seem to match up with the biblical description. What about the burial of Jesus and the tomb?
So the burial practices that we read about in the Gospels, those connect very well with what we know about practices in first century Judea. And that's to be expected. I don't think that's something that many people would say. would be invented by the gospel writers. But the tomb of Jesus, of course, we have some different candidates for that. And you have the traditional location, which is quite well known in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And then you have another location that was proposed in the 19th century known as the Garden Tomb. And then you have something that's much more recent called the Talpiot Tomb. And all three of these are quite different.
Well, I've been to the Holy Sepulchre, been to the Garden Tomb, and when I'm at the Garden Tomb, I really want it to be the right tomb because it just feels the way we think the story would. But it seems like the most likely candidate is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. How confident are we that that's actually the tomb of Jesus?
If I was to give that a percentage figure, I would say at least 99%.
Oh my goodness.
And we've got a lot of reasons why. So, although maybe it's best to start with why the other two have problems. So,
okay.
The Talpiot tomb, that's a very, very new proposal. And it's not at all the type of tomb that Jesus was buried in. It's a group of ossuaries. So it's actually a very typical type of tomb for Jews in the first century, but it's not the way in which we read about the burial of Jesus in the Gospels. Now, why was this proposed is because some of the names that were found inscribed on the ossuaries in there are the same names that we find for people in the Gospel stories. Like the name Joseph is in there, and Miriam is in there, and Matthew is in there, and so forth. Well, there is one ossuary which the promoters of this theory claim says Jesus, son of Joseph, but if you look at it, it really doesn't look at all like it says Jesus. It's very scribbled kind of, but Hanun is actually the name that a lot of other scholars propose is what it may have been saying. And then they constructed this whole idea that Jesus was married, and so his wife was buried there, and his mother, and Matthew's there, and all this, and some of Jesus' children, and so forth. Which we have nothing from ancient times that says any of that stuff is realistic. And why did the family move all of their bodies or get buried in Jerusalem when they were from Nazareth? And if you don't even have this clear inscription that it says Jesus, what's going on with that? And there's no ancient tradition of it. So the Talpiot tomb has been pretty handily rejected by many, many archaeologists, even secular archaeologists. So it's really not one that should cause much concern or confusion for people. But like you said, the Garden Tomb, that's a different story, because you go there and it really does feel much more like what we read in the Gospels. And that's actually one of the points of that place, is to give people a location that they can go that helps them to understand what the tomb of Jesus would have been like in that period and the area around it. And it is an ancient tomb. It's a tomb from ancient times, but it's a tomb that was first carved out in either the 8th or 7th century BC, around the time of Hezekiah. Not a new tomb during the time of Jesus. And then it was later reused in the Byzantine period. Okay, so the Byzantines, they're Christians. So Christians weren't going to be reusing the tomb of Jesus for people in. There's a lot of other backstory that goes with that location and with that alternate crucifixion site, but that it's disqualified based on the date of the tomb.
So tell me the positive reasons why you think the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is 99% likely the place.
So we're given some specific details about the tomb of Jesus in the Gospels. Things like it's a single chamber, arcosolium type tomb, stone sealed. There's a burial bench for the body. It was in a garden. It was a new tomb. and it's going to be just outside the walls of Jerusalem during the time of Jesus, right? And then we read some other things we can connect to it, like being in close proximity to the crucifixion site, and that there's a gate nearby, there's a road nearby. So we can look at all those things from, let's say, an architectural and geographic type of perspective. And the tomb is still in existence. It's all dressed up, yes, but it's still there. When Constantine had the church built, they cut away a lot of the rock around it, but they preserved itself, and they built this structure around it to preserve it. So we know it's a single chamber tomb, which is very important because there are no other single chamber tombs of the Roman period in the Jerusalem area of that type other than this tomb. And that's because no one reused it, or no one continued using it. The other tombs in the area, they were family tombs. Sometimes we call them loculi tombs.
Okay.
So you enter in through the main chamber, and think of that kind of where Jesus was buried. But then they would carve these hallways off of that and additional tomb chambers off of that. So you put your whole family over time in the same type of family tomb. Well, Jesus' tomb was not like that. They didn't bury anyone else in there. They didn't expand it. The burial bench is right there. Right now it's covered by a marble slab, but when National Geo was doing their reconstruction and kind of remodeling and fixing everything up, they removed that, and we could see the original limestone carved burial bench from the 1st century that was there. And the entrance is still there. So it's one of the ones that you pass through if you're going to go in and look at the tomb, because they've got an in and an out now. So the architecture fits the right type, and its uniqueness is one major argument for that. But it's also in a 1st century graveyard, so to speak. There are other rock carved tombs right around there that are from the 1st century of the Jewish type. So that fits. The area was, according to excavations that have been done there, it was a quarry that was turned into a garden in around the 1st century BC, and they found various types of seeds and indicating that it was turned into a garden around that period. So that also fits. It was outside the walls of 1st century Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. And that is really important because a misunderstanding of that is one of the things that led for this alternate crucifixion and tomb site to be proposed, Gordon's Calvary and then the Garden Tomb, because they were looking at the old city walls of Jerusalem. And obviously the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is inside the old city walls of Jerusalem. But those are from the Ottoman period, from the 16th century. Now, back in the 1st century, the tomb in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was outside the walls of Jerusalem. And then later they got expanded farther north and enclosed that area. But during the time of Jesus, it's in the right spot. We also have, I think, a very good argument from ancient tradition, and that is the Christians, they knew where this event happened. The resurrection, that's the most important event in Christianity. And so the location of that was really important to them. And Jerusalem was not a big city at this time. It was between probably 60 and 100,000 people. You can look at it geographically. It's tiny compared to our cities of today. And so people knew where things happened. Oh yeah, it's 2 blocks down there. And there was a continuous Christian presence in there all the way into the Byzantine period when that church got built. So people remembered where this happened. They weren't moving around as much as people do today. So, somebody's great grandpa said, hey, my dad showed me where the tomb of Jesus was. I'm going to take you and show you where it is. It's like something that happened in your neighborhood, basically. They understood this. But then the final thing that for me really solidifies it more, besides the ancient tradition about it, which is recorded in early church sources, is that Hadrian also built here. And he didn't just build anything here. He built this massive double temple to Jupiter and Venus, comparable to the one that he built in Rome to Roma and Venus, right by where the Colosseum is. And so he was trying to put the chief god of the Roman pantheon over the site of the tomb of Jesus and the resurrection, and get rid of that historical memory and make people think of the Roman gods instead. But in so doing, I think he helped to preserve the location. Because he didn't destroy it, he just built right on top of it.
That is so interesting to me that we have such confidence that this is the place where Jesus really was buried, and we know it. Would more critical scholars agree with you? Maybe they'd assess it 60, 70%, or is the scholarly community pretty on board with this being the burial spot of Jesus?
As far as archaeologists who work in that region, pretty much all of them agree that it's the tomb in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or if they aren't sure about that, they don't know, where it might be, but okay. It's a plausible area. They don't support the other tomb. No.
We're going to look at one last area, the resurrection of Jesus, but want to remind those viewing, we are just kind of skimming on the surface, so to speak, from Dr. Kennedy's book, Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, which I thoroughly enjoyed. You go into so much more depth, so many more examples from the birth and the ministry and the miracles and the trial and the death and the burial of Jesus, showing that step by step along the way, archaeology illuminates and arguably supports the reliability of these accounts. What about the resurrection of Jesus? Could there be, and is there, any archaeological discoveries that maybe corroborate this?
I would say the number one archaeological discovery that connects to the resurrection of Jesus is something called the Nazareth inscription. And this, a few years ago, it was virtually unknown, but some articles have been written about it more recently, and then just 2 years ago now, and another study came out about it, which talked about the origins of the stone itself, and that, I think, gave the artifact even more publicity. So what is this thing? What is this Nazareth inscription? Why is it called that? Well, it's called that simply because it was found in Nazareth, or that's where it turned up anyhow. So this is not from an official archaeological excavation. It came out on the antiquities market in the 1800s, and it was ended up in a collection in Paris, and it's still in Paris today. But it is this stone slab with a Greek inscription on it that is what's often called a rescript, a Roman rescript. So it was an official letter of the emperor that was sent to a province, to an official in the Roman Empire, with a new proclamation or law. So it's kind of like an edict, but the letter that they then inscribed, and they put it up in a place where everybody could see it. And the content of it is this: there's a new law, there's a new punishment, and that punishment is the death penalty, and it's for anyone who goes to a stone sealed sepulcher tomb and steals the body with wicked intent. All right, this is sort of strange and unprecedented, because first of all, people would steal goods out of graves. They would steal things that people were buried with that they could sell or use, but they wouldn't go around stealing bodies. That's very odd, first of all. And then to give the death penalty, that seems so extreme, right? They're moving a corpse out of a tomb. They have a death penalty. But it's not just any tomb. It doesn't just say anyone who is buried, any corpse. It's a specific type of tomb. And this is the type of tomb that Jesus was buried in. And that's not the way that everyone was buried in the Roman Empire. Jews were buried like that, yes, but Romans, they were cremated, and then their ashes were put in an urn. So it's a different type of situation, and it gets very, very specific. And then when we look at who wrote this, which emperor issued it, it looks like it's Emperor Claudius. Now, Claudius came into power in 41 AD. So Jesus' resurrection is in 33. We've got maybe 8 years until this happens. And that has given some time for the story of the resurrection to circulate. It's starting to have an effect. We know from Suetonius that Christianity had actually been causing problems in Rome itself in the reign of Claudius, because it says that he expelled Jews from Rome because there had been some conflicts about Christus or Christ. So Claudius seems to be trying to put a stop to the rumors of the resurrection and also make sure nothing else like this happens again. And it sounds exactly like the story in Matthew 28, where the Roman soldiers are told to say that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. Go spread that story. And I think that's what the Romans thought must have happened, or that was what they were going with anyway. And that's what you see reflected on this Nazareth inscription.
What an interesting inscription to come across, and a surprise that seems to indirectly confirm the biblical narrative of one account for what allegedly happened to the body of Jesus. So we've looked just kind of 30,000 foot view at roughly 10 events in the life of Jesus. Really just scratch the surface. You go into so much more depth in your book. You've been studying this for years. What is your assessment as a whole of the archaeological evidence for Jesus? And maybe give us a sense of a comparison of somebody else at that time who would be a public figure. Is Jesus more than typical figures? Is it less? Is it the same? Given your knowledge of the culture at that time and kind of the obscure eastern portion of the empire that Jesus lived in, should we be surprised at how much we have? Is it what we'd expect? How do you make sense as a whole of the archaeological evidence for Jesus?
Well, first, I would say that we have much more evidence than most people realize for the existence of Jesus and for the authenticity of the Gospels as a whole. For example, people often say or say that they've been told that there's no evidence for the existence of Jesus outside of the New Testament. But that's just absolutely not true. And we have several historians and philosophers from the 1st and 2nd century that mention Jesus and parts of his life. And I put that in the back of the book, all cataloged with those quotations and the authors and the dates. So we do have a lot of historical evidence for the existence of Jesus. And in relation to how that compares to other people at that time, like you asked, well, for someone who is in his position, so to speak, that is, he is a regular person. He's not a king. He's not a general. He's not a governor. We have so much more writing about him than anyone who was just, a carpenter, an itinerant preacher and teacher who had some disciples. There's a guy named Apollonius who was from a bit later than the time of Jesus. And we have a little bit of writings about him, but we don't have nearly the amount of material about this guy as we do about Jesus. And all of the places that Jesus visited and these different buildings that are mentioned in the gospel and so forth, there's just a lot more corroboration. Now, if we're going to compare Jesus to somebody like Augustus or Caesar, that's a totally different thing. And that's not really even a valid comparison, because these emperors, they had statues of themselves carved and all these inscriptions, monumental inscriptions. But if people are going to accept the Gospels as historical records, well, we do have a huge historical record about Jesus, like we have historical records about people such as Augustus and Julius Caesar. But it's just amazing, I think, the amount of historical and archaeological attestation to Jesus and the writings about him in the Gospels. It's just really beyond what we see for other people of his same time, location, and social status.
So one of the objections people will raise, and I think it's a fair question, is to say, well, fictional accounts are often written and tied in places like superhero movies in New York City, and they have the backdrop of being veridical, certain place, certain time that could be supported by archaeology. It doesn't at all mean that they're true. So how do you view the archaeological discovery? Does it illuminate, or in some way does it actually help contribute to the reliability of the gospel account and the historical Jesus? If so, why and how?
Much of that does just illuminate, and like the Spider-Man New York argument type of thing. Yes, Jerusalem existed, Nazareth existed, Capernaum existed, all this kind of stuff. We could even get into the synagogue in Capernaum and so forth. But then when you keep going farther and farther to things like the Pool of Bethesda had a temple to Asclepius built over it, that starts to get into the realm of that goes beyond just it existed. Like the Romans knew about the story of the miracles of Jesus. And then when you look at all the philosophers and historians of the 1st and 2nd centuries that talk about Jesus, and they talk about him doing things like being a teacher, having disciples, performing miracles, going on trial before Pontius Pilate, being crucified, etc. That then we're getting into specific events that are talked about in the life of Jesus in the Gospels, and that's much more than just mythology being set in a real geographic place.
Final question. Are there any issues you're aware of that seem to contradict or undermine the gospel accounts as it relates to the life, death, or ministry of Jesus?
So one of them that we discussed that's often brought up is this census and the involvement of Quirinius. I think that we have evidence and good explanation that demonstrates Luke is being historically accurate there. And we have some other cases where people will bring up objections. But I think in all of those cases, either we can explain that or there is evidence that shows the Gospels are getting it right. Or it may just be, at this time, an argument from silence from the archaeological sources. And we really have to say, we don't know. We'll have to wait to see what else is turned up. But I don't think that we have anything that's been discovered archaeologically that contradicts the gospel accounts about Jesus.
I said last question, but one more. Do you have any anticipation or guess of where archaeology is going as it relates to Jesus over the next 5 or 10 years? Like, are there certain digs that might illuminate certain cities? Are there, like what do you see on the horizon that may be coming down the chute, so to speak? And are you optimistic that more finds are yet to be uncovered?
So there's a lot of excavation going on in Jerusalem in particular, and at some of the other sites that are relevant to the Gospels, like Chorazin and Tiberias. There have been some excavations at Bethlehem and Nazareth too. But really, I think the amount of excavation being done in Jerusalem gives us hope that there is going to be more material that comes up connected to Jesus that will, at the very least, illuminate the gospel accounts, but maybe we'll find some inscriptions that are talking about Jesus or talking about other characters and events in the gospel stories.
Well, it's exciting to track and follow. I really do appreciate the work that you do, the arguments that you give, but just the reserved tone that doesn't overstate the evidence. Because if these events are true, we don't need to overstate them. And like you said, there's powerful evidence that just corroborates and illuminates the birth, the life, the miracles, the death, and even the resurrection of Jesus. So I want to commend for our viewers, it's such a good read. This is my go-to book on the archaeology of Jesus now, called Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, from Titus Kennedy. And we'd love you to think about studying with both of us at Biola University. Dr. Kennedy teaches classes on archaeology for us, and I do resurrection, problem of evil, and other classes as well. Dr. Kennedy, thanks so much for taking the time to come on and talk about the archaeological evidence for Jesus.